Welcome. Can you hear us, sir?
Yes.
All right. We're just talking about the John Oliver show. We're just getting into it.
That's
We
right.
introduced you briefly. We'd like for you to describe yourself for a moment. We talked about the Forbes 30 under 30 top scientists and so on. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. I'm a research scientist and author here in New York City, and I've been involved with blockchain. Actually, I'm a relatively recent entry in that. I've just come in mostly over the past year. God, it's been a little bit over a year now. And I've been involved with the EOS community here in New York, still trying to kind of get to know everybody and figure out kind of how large this community is and how deep it goes. And so far, it's been really great.
And I remember I met you up in New York when I went to the meetup
That's
at the beginning of February. It was a pleasure, and that's partly why we were hoping to bring you in here. You are one of the most passionate people I have met about EOS. Your background outside of blockchain is very impressive. So you're obviously a bright guy. And so let's jump right into it. What are your thoughts on this John Oliver situation here that we have going on? Go ahead and describe it for us.
Yeah. So I think there's a pretty large amount of confusion regarding exactly how these new initial coin offerings are going to work, particularly like in a legal sense. So John Oliver was kind of poking fun at EOS in particular, just because, well, it's the largest kind of online crowd sale that's ever been conducted in the history of humankind. Right, it's $1.5 billion now, something very, very massive like that. And the way that they're doing it is this very kind of intricate economic design wherein you pay into this token contract and you get out these tokens. And these tokens are, they're technically kind of these worthless IOUs. They're not even IOUs, right? They're just these markers by the fact that you want to participate in this community. And then at some point soon, the people at Block One, which is the company behind EOS, is going to finish the software and they're going to release it open source to the community. And then the community is essentially going to start this thing themselves, probably using the distribution of these, tokens. But of course, that means that when you go to interact with this online anonymous crowd sale, you essentially have to read like pages and pages of legalese that says, these things are really worthless unless somebody decides to do something with them, right? Like the people who are writing the software aren't the ones who are going to be deciding what to do with this software or how to launch it. So this creates a very interesting scenario, right, where it's kind of hilarious that people have put in over $1 billion into this thing, and I think John Oliver was, kind of playing that for humor and saying, like, look how kind of completely ridiculous this is. And in one sense, he's correct. In another sense, it's like, well, these things are developing new economic models that we haven't seen before. And this is one of them, right? You just grow the community first, and then you deliver the product, and it's the community who decides how to use the product.
It's also a community that contributes tools as well to the overall software, and I think that's interesting. We have Chintai that's out there. It's going to be a leasing sort of program, and we know that Block One is also working on some leasing functions as well too. So that's interesting how the community is also writing software as part of the overall effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a bunch of ways to get involved kind of at the community level. So one of the big, issues, like, first of all, in the John Oliver segment, again, he kind of goes after Brock Pierce in particular, who's a member of the Block One team, as kind of speaking about the effect that decentralization will have. It's going to change everything and so on. And, I think that in that sense, he's talking about crypto in general, possibly not, it's literally changing every single aspect of our lives. But I do think that at this point, it's somewhat inevitable that just like the internet drastically permeates, the fabric of everyday life, at some point, relatively soon in the future, like the blockchain will do effectively that. And once you kind of realize that, you kind of realize where we are in this technological adoption curve, and that it's going to become an S shape no matter what. Statements like it's going to change everything, it's very easy to make fun of that on a late night talk show, but it's probably somewhat real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think. Go ahead.
Have you guys seen the clip with Brian Gumbel and Katie Couric about the email? I don't know how many people have seen that, but that's hilarious. And
explain email to me. Yeah.
What is that @ sign?
Yeah.
What are we going to say nowadays, Yeah, so Lambos and all of that stuff is just part of everything that goes along with it, and that doesn't detract from the fact that this is amazing technology and it's going to change things.
And let me give an example of why I'm like in particular excited about EOS in comparison to say like a lot of the other cryptocurrencies, like something like Bitcoin or so on, right? So I think we're moving from this previous conception of these decentralized ledgers as being, first we have the usage of currency, like something like Bitcoin, and then we have something that's like much more complex, like Ethereum, which acts as sort of this computer, and you can run these, like it basically is a Turing complete virtual machine, and you can run on this distributed ledger as well. And I think that this is kind of the beginning of building communities around these distributed ledgers. And this is going to sound like a little bit crazy, but I think that in the future, what we conceive of as some sort of political system is going to be a lot more fluid, and it's going to be a lot more essentially tokenized. I mean, I really think that there's not. It makes a lot of sense to build these kind of decentralized commonwealths that exist pretty much digitally. Tezos is pretty much the only other blockchain community thinking this way, and that they're building a commonwealth. They're not just building a bunch of code. They're building a community that's going to exist on top of the code, and it's going to have all sorts of ownership rights and property rights. It'll have legal disputes. It'll have all sorts of different things within it. And I think that EOS directly having a constitution is an example of how it's basically the first of this very kind of futuristic form of governance. And at first it'll be a little bit more local, and it won't replace anything like a nation state. But eventually, who knows?
Well, that's what I was saying at the top of the show as well. This kind of the John Oliver show. It's a very, of course, it's going to happen, right? We all kind of admit that we're passionate and somewhat ridiculous in some ways because we just love EOS, and we know it is going to make a big difference. But however, the token sale terms, they don't make much sense to anyone outside. Took me personally a couple days to really wrap my head around the whole thing. Like, why would they do this? And so on and so forth. But once you get it, it makes sense, but it is hard to get there. And it also, this segues nicely into our next point, which is about, you mentioned a digital commonwealth, which is a strong set of words. We want to avoid the word security. And there has been recent talk about Block One and a possible know your customer or KYC type of situation happening before the launch of the chain. I know Dan has come in and cleared up a few things today. What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, so I was actually paying attention to the Telegram earlier today as well, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of I would say lack of clarity around exactly how this chain launch is going to go forward. And let me give an example of this, which is that previously we didn't know. There was this question of, well, why should the community respect the initial token distribution when they launch this thing? So why should you paid to get this one IOU? Why should you receive your one like EOS on the blockchain when the chain does actually launch, right? And at first, I think it wasn't very clear, and the assumption was that maybe there'll be like a bunch of these different chains. But then at some point, it became very clear that there'd be an immense economic gravity well towards the adoption of the original token list without anyone specifying or legally saying that they have to do that. And one example of that is the EOS VC fund, which is a $1.375 billion at this point VC fund that goes to financing the ecology of the chain. And that's pretty assuredly going to be the chain, whichever chain has the token distribution, the correct token distribution on it with all the holders of it. So in that sense, the problem kind of solved itself, in that like people weren't really aware of the chain, they weren't aware of the fund for a while, and so they weren't really aware of how this economic gravity would kind of pull and basically ensure that the chains would start with a particular distribution. So I think we're kind of in a position of similar lack of clarity regarding the know your customer, like within the U.S. Because of the financial regulations that are currently in place. Block One doesn't want anyone from the U.S. buying tokens, and similarly for Chinese citizens as well. But in general, I think the concern was that if they had sold this $1.5 billion kind of anonymous crowd-sailed thing. And then it turned out that later, because of pressure, maybe from a financial institution or because somebody basically changed their mind, you would have had to undergo this like rigorous know your customer process in order to kind of like claim these things. That would have been like a really, really serious problem. I personally don't know whether or not that is happening, right? I think it's still like a little bit unclear, but my current analogy is that it's similar to back when it was unclear why exactly the chain would have a certain economic gravity to it.
Yeah, and it's part of what you said, with the KYC, and that's partly what Dan talked about today as well. Is that cannot be coded into the software itself, right? It has to be something the community is launching the chain, right? And so therefore the block producers would have to be the ones that enforce that KYC.
And that doesn't seem possible. I mean, at first it doesn't seem very possible, just because I think somebody pointed out that there's something like 200,000 EOS addresses right now. I mean, if you wanted to get the chain started in like a few days, you can imagine that it would be completely impossible to organize, which block producers are going to do which KYCs and so on. Like, it becomes this really difficult process. At the same time, I think today Dan talked about different levels of permissions. So, I mean, what I would like to see with something like EOS is, because I do think that in building a digital commonwealth, reputation is very important. So you need identities on the chain, or at least identities to a certain degree. So what I would like to see is essentially that the chain starts effectively anonymously, right? Because that's the fastest way to do it. It's the fastest way to grow the community. I mean, you can say, please don't do this, et cetera. But, in practice, you're just allowing anyone to contribute. And then you transition to, kind of like the final evolution of this thing, which is that there are all these accounts with associated names, reputation scores, social links, people who they're connected to via hacked account recovery, kind of connections and so on. So, I mean, that would be the ideal, but it would be, I think, helpful if Block One at any point kind of specified maybe a little bit more about how they see the evolution of that.
Well, they did mention KYC Oracle. So when you have an Oracle system, you have a system that you can look up. So it's almost like a lookup table, and then you look up and you use that system to do KYC. So maybe it'll be down to the DApp level, where particular dApps will use that Oracle in order to tap into that functionality.
Right. Yeah, and that's I think that's a likely, like that's definitely a likely outcome, that this becomes DApp based. I think that Dan Larimer, the engineer of EOS, or the main one, is he's got some very particular or he's got a very particular vision about how I think EOS should function, and it involves this notion that he talks about called radical transparency. And that's a very, I think, interesting notion. It's a very powerful one. And by what he means by radical transparency, it's essentially that there are no, and forgive me if I like misparaphrase his point, but that there are no like anonymous wallets. And you can imagine how that would make, theft has been a really big problem in something like Bitcoin, right? Where anyone can create an address. And what that means is that if somebody sends, tokens, if they get into your account and they send tokens to this anonymous address, that's just going to enter some mixer or go into some exchange. There's no way to track that or get that back or whatever. And they can do this many, many times. Whereas in EOS, if it was the case that real identities, even real world identities, were associated with wallets, essentially, such that you can't really, you basically have to send only between these known accounts, then suddenly, like, if you're a thief, right, you have to find some way to like get a real account, that goes through this KYC process. You have to be sure that that's somehow not going to lead back to you in real life. And then you can only get away with using it once anyways, to get money once. So I think it makes the chain like much more secure from this really big problem that we see even now with these like Twitter scams. We see it like all the time with Ethereum and Bitcoin. The problem is kind of getting from what people in cryptocurrencies are used to, which is basically, radical like opaqueness, where nobody knows anything about anybody, to this point where everybody knows everything about everybody in this digital commonwealth. And, hopefully that will be a slow evolution rather than let's try to just like kickstart this thing really hardcore right off the bat.
I think we as people, we tend to think in dualities, like you just mentioned, and it's either radical opaqueness or radical transparency. But effectively, in the end, what you have is a tool which will enable multiple. It's not a one-size-fit-all sort of solution. It's going to be several different solutions, and the free market is going to choose, right? So maybe one area of EOS, a DApp, or if it's down to the DApp level, we don't know. But if you were to choose between a DApp using KYC and a DApp where you don't have KYC, it's really up to the user at the end to select which one they would want to use. And,
right.
And it's just like going to the store. You wouldn't want to have just one soft drink that you want to buy, and we know which one Kevin wants to buy. But it would be, you want to have a selection there, and I think that's what the tool is the software is enabling.
Yeah, and it could even be different chains too. There might be some kind of privacy chain that for EOS that is able. Someone enables a new technology that allows for a privacy chain to exist with the EOS software, and it would communicate hopefully with all the other EOS chains, which would be pretty interesting. We'll see how that works out, and that let's kind of lead into the speculation. Where do we think EOS in general is going if we assume that everything works out, the launch goes fairly smoothly, and there is one dominant chain? What are your thoughts on the future of EOS if you compare it to a couple other blockchains?
Right. So I think that we're in this interesting situation where, if you look, so I spent some time kind of after getting into this, looking at the history of these things. And I think that we're very clearly in this like generation 3 moment where these new cryptocurrencies are coming onto the scene that are, in some senses, you can use the word superior, but I use that word just to mean directly technologically in their capabilities. Like, so for instance, Ethereum is clearly kind of superior than Bitcoin in that direct technological sense, and that it's far more flexible, it's Turing complete, it can do all these things. But of course, Bitcoin still has a larger market share than Ethereum because with complexity comes the possibility of bugs and mistakes and all these other things, and Bitcoin is much more secure and does one thing very simply. I think these Gen 3 coins are really kind of stepping it up in that suddenly all these usability problems, which I think is the number one issue with anything involving blockchain. I mean, we talked earlier about that moment, that very famous now famous moment on where news anchors are basically asking each other, what's email, what's an @ symbol, how does that work, right? I don't think it's unreasonable to say that using blockchains now to do really anything is about 10 times harder than even like using simple forms of email early on in the history of the internet. Like it's just very, very difficult. And what's more, everything involves money. So it's like, if you make a mistake, all your money is gone because you made a mistake. And it's basically like, you sent the wrong email, right? You can just imagine it that way. Right? Like, you sent the wrong email. Well, all your money is gone now that you sent the wrong email. So, what I think that a lot of these Gen 3 cryptos are trying to do, and there's only a small handful of them, right? I mean, there's really only, something like Fluiqua, Tezos, EOS, and, a small handful of others. And what I think EOS in particular is going to do far better than any of the other Gen 3 cryptos is get the usability to the state at which people can actually have accounts on these things that don't know what the heck a blockchain is. They don't spend hours trying to figure out how any of this stuff works. They don't copy paste like maniacs and like do crazy stuff like load, files on, computers that you've wiped, you have like your dedicated, crypto laptop or whatever, right? Like no one is going to do that. So I think EOS in particular has, I think of all the chains, the highest chance because of its properties of usability and the things like hacker account recovery and 2-factor authentication to have a DApp that ends up number one app in the App Store. I think that's if EOS achieves what it sets out to do. It gets that number one.
So what
app.
You're saying is like we really need that killer app, or we need that sort of the same way email added that level of complexity, but it also enabled us to send messages to each other a lot faster, right? So there was that big benefit to it, and we just need to see that from something developed on these technologies.
Well, it needs to be seamless too. You can't have a user having, like you just said, you can't have a user trying to figure out how to use private keys or what the private key even is and all this and that. It needs to be usable. But
yeah, no, absolutely. And the fact is that, I mean, and you could clearly see this in the market recently when the market, I think probably almost universally agreed upon at this point that the price of the market outstripped the usability of any of these things, right? Where like Bitcoin transaction fees were flirting with like $40 to send some Bitcoin to somebody. It's completely insane. Now it's much lower, and you know, it seems like things are getting a little bit better. But Ethereum, which is another big DApp platform, is very similar to that. And I don't think that there's any evidence that it will be able to handle any sort of transaction load or run something like a decentralized Uber or a decentralized Airbnb or a decentralized Facebook on it. And I think that EOS is probably the first thing that's at all capable of doing anything like that. And it does it through a few clever design choices. Of course, and those design choices lead us to like debates about exactly what's going to happen with KYC and with all these other issues.
Yeah, not to mention that with Bitcoin, when they stopped accepting Bitcoin at the Bitcoin conference in January because the transaction fees were so high, that's when we become fodder for late night TV, right?
Yeah.
And EOS, of course, is another easy target at this point. Give us another year when the blockchain is launched and things are rolling. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, you know, like John Oliver is going to get out in like a foreign city in like 2 years, and he's going to want to hail like a taxi, and he's going to use his like EOS app. So, like, you know, it's like, you know, laugh now, and that's good. And it was very humorous and I think funny segment. But
everyone eventually knew what the @ meant.
Yeah, precisely. It's like it seems very foreign and weird. Yes.
Erik, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I always enjoy hearing your opinion. You were just phenomenal. You're well spoken. You're a very bright guy. So thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. We should do this again.
Yeah, we definitely would like to. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Erik.